He is Sam Rosenberg on the Disc Institute of Pittsburgh Newsline. We have to stop meeting because of situations like this, but they just don't seem to go away. And thank goodness that you are out there with your staff and employees helping people protect themselves when they find themselves, Sam, in a very precocious and very dangerous situation. Good evening.
Good evening, Rob.
You know, one of the things that you say, and makes so much sense, it's good to have a lifeguard, but it's better to know how to swim. And I know exactly what that means, because sometimes, and thank goodness for Columbus SWAT and law enforcement in that area, that they thwarted this thing and ended it before it got worse. But sometimes, and these people earlier today found out when this 18-year-old college student plunged at them in his automobile and began wielding a butcher knife, sometimes good things just don't happen to good people, but bad things happen to good people. So just thoughts about this today and how it's become such a common occurrence in the society that we live in today, Sam.
Well, once again, what we have here is one of our most common themes that I always talk about is that violence is never random. We use this term random violence to describe almost anything in the media. We say, another act of random violence, so-and-so just snapped, et cetera. But the reality is that the violence always has purpose and meaning to the perpetrator. And the most important thing that people can do is have the ability to recognize danger when they see it. Now, that's not as easy as a lot of people think. Here's a perfect example. This guy, was not just your average student. I mean, I'm looking right now at some of the posts on his Facebook page, where he talks about how, I'm sick and tired of seeing my fellow Muslim brothers and sisters being killed and tortured everywhere. Stop interfering with other countries, especially Muslim communities. If you want us Muslims to stop carrying out lone wolf attacks. All the indicators were there that this guy was a ticking time bomb and a potential, terrorist, in our midst. And this is the type of thing that is very common with mass killers, is that the indicators are there, just people are not trained in what to look for. In this case, it was pretty obvious. If anyone had been looking, they would have known what they were seeing. But that being said, how do you respond if you're on the X? What you can do immediately is, as the law enforcement community has been beating the drum of for years now, is the run, hide, fight principle. If you can't run and get off the X, then barricade and lock yourself in and try and hide and give that law enforcement, those lifeguards, time to get there. And if you can't do that, and you can't run and you can't hide, what do you do when you come face to face with an armed intruder? You have to have the skills to be able to fight back. Because if you don't have the skills and the prior training, the natural response is going to be to go into a state of paralysis or panic, neither of which is helpful to survival.
All right, quoting now, he waited till everyone was clear and the stabber clearly wasn't stopping. Throughout the attack, the assailant didn't yell or say anything. He was completely silent, which was very creepy. Not even when he was shot by police, according to one student. The cop that subdued the guy with the knife saved so many lives, and I couldn't agree more. One of the things, and I'm not asking you to really take a stance on this, but law enforcement has been under a lot of scrutiny of late. But one thing I think we will both agree on, when you are in a desperate situation, there is no better person, no man or woman, that you would rather have at your side than some member of law enforcement. And thank goodness for that officer today.
I think that the law enforcement community is a magnificent community doing an incredibly thankless job day in and day out, dealing most of the time with some of the worst possible examples of humanity. And, the level of violence and vitriol directed at law enforcement is absolutely out of control and absolutely has to be brought to an end. Because as you see here, a law enforcement officer responding instantly to the situation at hand and putting his life on the line to stop someone. And I'll tell you that it's no easy task, as not only running to the sounds of the commotion, running to the sounds of the guns very often, to face down that evil, but it's also no easy task taking a human life, even in a situation like this. So, people need to give law enforcement just a little bit more credit, for God's sake.
Sam Rosenberg will be in the next segment talking about what you can do, just some tips, but I highly urge you Take a class, check it out, livewithconfidence.com. You can find it, INPAX, on Facebook. Or if you go to my Facebook, you will definitely be able to link into what he does. One of the things that I talked about in a blog earlier today was the fact that they gave out a Buckeye alert in many facets, kind of like an Amber Alert. Many people know what that is, but this one was actually at times, blasting through loudspeakers at the campus there, Walnut Street and College Road, saying, run, fight, hide, seek, do whatever, but there could be an active shooter. Everyone, please take cover. Do you think that approach is a good idea? Because I'm just thinking one of the things that you want people to do, you want them to remain calm in a situation like that. And when that is being blared out and you have a bunch of people just looking for a mass exit sign just to get out of harm's way, they can actually get in each other's way. Your thoughts as a man who is all about self-preservation and defense, that type of alert over a loudspeaker in the heart of chaos such as today at Ohio State?
The most important thing, as I just said, is to be able to recognize danger for what it is. So getting the alert out there and notifying people, even if it's something as simple as a loudspeaker system like that, I think is an excellent effort. I'll give you an example, Rob. I was in an airport not too long ago, and this obviously some kind of violence alert system started blaring over the loudspeaker, saying, there is a situation in the airport. Remain calm, and there was no further information given. There was no further direction given, but everyone in the entire area that I was in was obviously unhinged by this issue, but no one knew what to do. So when you're broadcasting a warning, it's not sufficient to broadcast a warning saying there's an event going on. You got to give them directions. And from what I understand about the Buckeye Alert, they said, run, hide, fight, seek cover, shelter in place. They gave very specific directions. One thing I want to tell you I noticed in this was there was a Facebook post or a tweet where one of the students posted a tweet saying, we're safe here. We're barricaded in our room. We have chairs barricading our door. Did you notice that, Rob?
Yeah, and I was going to give Facebook a little love because a lot of times you hear about these rants, as you mentioned, from Abdul Razik Ali Atran's Facebook page, and you were actually, and rather appropriately, reading some of his posts. But they also had a safe page out there that people were able to go to let loved ones know they were safe. So once again, technology, I think, can be a great tool in a situation like this.
It's a great asset. But I want to go back to that image for a second. What you saw were a bunch of chairs piled in front of a door, and if you go back to that image and look at it closely, what you're going to notice is that door opens outward into the hallway. So from a tactical standpoint, I want you to understand this is one of the most important things we teach when we're teaching with schools, when we're teaching with workplaces. Fire code 99% of the time dictates the door is going to open outward into the hallway. And most of those doors, especially in public institutions, whether they're schools or universities, they can't be locked unless you have a key. Go out into the hallway and manually lock the door from the outside, if it even has a lock. So the problem you have is when people start to pile chairs and tables in front of the door, that doesn't prevent the bad guy from opening the door and getting access to you. It doesn't prevent them from shooting you over those chairs and tables if they have a firearm. What it does prevent you from doing is getting to that bad guy or getting out of that room. So what I want you to understand is that when an image like that starts to blast out through social media, in the vacuum of better training and better options, people lock that into their cerebrum and say, okay, this is what I'm going to do if I'm in that situation. But the reality is it's counterintuitive. Even though that seems like the best thing, it's the illusion of safety. What you want to be able to do is position yourself to be able to respond if someone comes through that door that needs to be responded to, but not to limit your exit route.
All right, he is Sam Rosenberg. I'm going to keep him a little while longer, even maybe through the bottom of the half hour, because there is so much stuff to get to, and I highly recommend you go to livewithconfidence.com. And as we have learned today, not just from this incident, but so many others, the one in Orlando, San Bernardino, Paris, France, you just never know. So why not at least livewithconfidence.com? We'll be back. All right, we've been talking about what happened earlier today when an Ohio student of Somalian descent rammed his car into a group of pedestrians before exiting the vehicle with a knife and slashing people. Officer Alan Haruko shot the knife-wielding man when he failed to comply with orders to put down his weapon. This was a student who actually was an eyewitness and was in the middle of the chaos today.
I heard a bunch of screaming, so I took my headphones out, and all these people were rushing over this way. At first, I thought it was some sort of game or something, until I could see everyone's faces. They were terrified.
Hatred continues to be such a part of who we all are today, and a lot of people are suffering because of it. Now, you know, we've talked, and I've actually seen you demonstrate with a weapon, what it would be like, even in a semi-automatic weapon, as opposed to a handgun, as opposed to a knife. What makes this situation more difficult, or maybe gives the innocent bystander, because it's only a knife, maybe a chance to survive more so than it would be a gun? How do you look at the two different weapons, Sam?
The knife is a more complex weapon to deal with if you have to engage the attacker, because it's in motion. It's very difficult. You can't grab the weapon and restrain it. You have to grab the attacker's arm to restrain him. It's a much more difficult process when you're dealing with close contact. But because it's not a projectile weapon, you can run away a lot easier. As you can see, it's also not as damaging. So, you know, a firearm is still going to be the more difficult dynamic to deal with. But this type of attack, I want you to understand, is we're starting to see more and more of these in the United States. There was an attack in a Minnesota mall, you know, with a knife. There was, Franklin Regional High School, if you remember, a couple of years ago here in Pittsburgh, in Murraysville. And we had, there was actually a machete attack in Columbus earlier this year. You're starting to see this, and this pattern of attack with a car and a knife is directly related to the type of jihadi behavior that's going on in Israel right now. What we saw over the last 2 years was the, quote, knife intifada in Israel, where the Islamic terrorist organizations are pushing this dynamic of simple, unconventional lone wolf attacks using very simple means. Grab a knife, use your car, that sort of thing. And that makes it very, very difficult from the responder standpoint, because, as you said many times, it can happen anywhere. I heard the student that you just put on talk about how he heard screaming, so he had to pull his headset out of his ears to figure out what was going on. Listen, a lot of us listen to music or listen with a headset, but the technology in some cases is blinding us to what's going on around us. You know, if you have no situational awareness, your response time is going to be much lower. This doesn't mean you have to walk around in red alert all the time. It just means, given the way the world is, unless you are in an absolutely safe environment where you are comfortable that you have control of what's going on, it may not be a bad idea just to keep your headset out of your ears so you can pay attention to what's going on around you a little better.
Sam Rosenberg, my guest, livewithconfidence.com. Impacts. Tell them about Impacts a little bit and what you are all about.
We're Impacts, as you mentioned before, our philosophy is it's good to have a lifeguard, but ultimately you should know how to swim. All of us come from a background in close protection, law enforcement, military, and the intention of our organization is to provide truly full-spectrum personal security instructions. That's everything from self-defense, or we like to call defensive tactics, all the way through defensive firearms to critical incident response. We work with individuals and families in age-appropriate ways, with young kids all the way through adults, of course. We work with corporations dealing with workplace violence prevention and response. We work with schools, teaching teachers what to do if they come face-to-face with an armed intruder and how to identify them in the first place. So anything that deals with violence in today's society, we can teach you how to recognize it, manage it, prepare for it, or respond to it.
One of the things they talked about, it was hard for the assailant to get a clean shot, if you will, on someone because there were so many people, and it was hard for him to focus on one person. So is there something to it when it is one person against a large group of people to stay shoulder to shoulder, strength in numbers?
Well, what you have there is what you had going on there is you can imagine in your mind's eye first of all, the car attack, what preceded the car attack was he pulled the fire alarm, okay, which drove people outside of the building and into crowds, into huddles, which is what he targeted with his car. And I don't know for a fact that he pulled the fire alarm, but all indications seem to point to that was part of the planned process. But the car attack is the blind side. When he jumps out of the car with a knife and starts chasing people around, the natural inclination for most people is going to be to run from that, which is the appropriate reaction. So you can imagine people running from this bad guy and him, switching targets. He's not going to be able to catch many good targets, and that's what ultimately led to that downfall of him being able to, succeed in his mission and actually, have a lot of casualties of a significant sort. Not that anyone's injuries by any means are insignificant.
All right, hold that thought, because I want to come back and I want to ask you a question about, we have a good friend by the name of Lou Gentile, CSI investigators, and they do train people how to fire a weapon that they have a permit to carry. Should more people learn that, and could it help them in a situation like this? That's next with Sam Rosenberg.
News Radio 1020 KDKA.
It's Rob Pratte's Monday Night Machine. KDKA.
Okay, Sam Rosenberg, my guest. We've got CBS News about a minute from now, and then we'll come back and continue to talk with him. We were talking about Lou Gentile. Lou Gentile, Act 235, actually training those to use a firearm that are in this business of security. So we're going to talk about security. Is it a good thing? Can it actually help or hurt a situation like this? And then as far as Sam Rosenberg and LiveWithConfidence.com, they actually can teach people at local firing ranges where they need to know is what they need to know as far as being able to use their weapon of choice. And obviously a permit to carry that weapon is something that is a very necessary part of what they do as well, too. So we're going to really kind of try to cover as many things as we can concerning today's incident at Ohio State when we come back with Sam Rosenberg. Lots more still to come tonight, plus we're going to get into some open phones as well, too. But now back to our conversation talking about what happened at Ohio State earlier today. You heard CBS Radio News talking about it. They've been discussing it all day long, as we have here in our KDKA radio newsroom. And he, of course, is from Impacts. You can find out more by going to livewithconfidence.com. All right, so what about the adage of having hired security that actually is armed security, and also people arming themselves to give themselves more security in a possible situation like today? Sam Rosenberg.
So, Rob, I think that any kind of security, if they're properly trained and competent, is an advantage, because what you're doing is you're putting dedicated eyes on that environment so that people who are in the environment, say at a nightclub, they're there to have fun, to enjoy themselves. Students at the university are there to, go to school and focus on what they have to do. And being able to trust that the lifeguards are there paying attention is important. Having armed security, I think, is important, because the idea here is that when we're dealing with an armed potential attacker, in this kind of incident, and I know they keep saying that they're still looking for a motive, but look, this is a terrorist attack, okay? It's a lone wolf terrorist attack, but it is a classic example of the lone wolf psychology and the lone wolf dynamic of an attack. This is a premeditated, motivated attack in an organized manner with a very specific kind of outcome intended. And what we're talking about here is having an armed responder there, in this case, a university police officer, was the decisive factor in bringing the attacker down swiftly. So having competently trained, certified, licensed security officers, particularly those that are armed, can be a decisive advantage. Absent that, I am a huge advocate for the citizens' right to be able to protect themselves. Whether it's with your bare hands or whether it's with a legally carrying firearm, the ability to be able to protect yourself is absolute. And, the key, though, is always training. It's one thing to own a gun. It's another thing to know how to use it. The difference is like owning a piano and being able to play it. So, the idea here is that you have to invest in the training to become competent with that tool. But once you have that tool, it can be a decisive force multiplier and give you an advantage in even the worst situations.
One of the things that I've often asked myself, and I've talked to the listener who actually has a license to carry a weapon, and that is, when do you know that time has arrived to use the weapon? Or is that just so different for so many people and situations that you know it's a gut instinct as opposed to someone trying to teach you that, Sam?
Here's the thing. When we look at it, there's two ways to answer that question. Number one, it's absolutely vital, and this is one of the things that I love about Lou Gentile, who you mentioned earlier. Lou and I have partnered so many times on training projects and everything else. One of the reasons is because Lou is one of the most competent experts that I know when it comes to use of force and the justification thereof. Teaching people how and when it is justifiable to use force and what level of force is as important as the physical skills with the tool itself. And that's a big part. That's in the DNA of our training system is the legalities of justification of force. Because it's one thing to know how to use the gun. It's another thing to know when to use it. The reality is there's a legal dimension there that must be part of your training. Second component is when we talk about knowing when the decisive moment has arrived, when you have no alternative other than to use force, potentially deadly force. I'll make a bad analogy. I jokingly say it's like the Supreme Court definition of pornography. You know it when you see it. Now that's a flippant answer. It's a little bit of an easy way to answer the question, but the reality is most people are going to know decisively that they have run out of options to escape. They have run out of options to mitigate a situation at a lower level, and the only level of response is some level of force. Having the ability to use something other than deadly force is vital, though, because for people who carry concealed weapons, a lot of them, they carry a concealed firearm and they figure, I don't need self-defense, I don't need any other training because I've got my gun. But the reality is the law will tell you can only use that firearm in very narrow, very specific circumstances, and outside of those circumstances, you cannot even pull it out. So the idea here is that you have to be able to understand the dimensions of the legalities and how that impacts your training so that you truly understand why full spectrum training is important. It doesn't mean you have to invest in training for the rest of your life. It means that you have to have the right training so that you at least understand when to use what level of force and how.
Now, if someone was there with a license to carry, and they were far enough away that they were out of harm's way, but they had a clean shot on the assailant, seeing this person doing all of this bodily damage to people, many people still in the hospital and will be recovering from wounds and obviously metal wounds for many years to come, would pull that weapon out and take down the assailant. Would they be in the right even if they weren't in danger?
In my professional opinion, absolutely, okay, because what you have is in a situation like that where someone is rampaging and with the obvious intent of committing serious bodily injury or committing harm, deadly force harm, they're trying to kill or commit serious bodily injury to people around them, you have the ability to protect those other folks with the same force that they would be able to protect themselves. Now, whether you should is a different discussion because the tactics and the reality of that is complex. If a student, for example, or a bystander who's legally carrying pulls a gun out, rushes to the scene and shoots the bad guy and puts him down, what's going to be the immediate effect when law enforcement arrives? There's a tactical consideration there whether or not law enforcement sees the shooter as the potential bad guy in this case, even though the shooter was justified and rushing to the aid of others. So there's a consideration there that has to be weighed when looking at should you respond. On top of that, I'll tell you right now, your primary duty in that situation is to make sure that you and your family are off the X and safe. So if you're in a situation where you can get yourself to safety or get others to safety, that is a perfectly viable alternative as well. And that doesn't mean to say we recommend abandoning people behind, but everyone has to be able to respond to the best of their ability. If I was at that situation, I would definitely be moving to the scene of the attack to try and help. If I'm there with my family, my first priority is to get my family to a safe environment first and make sure that they are safe. Then I might go back if I think that I can make a difference.
Another story in the news, we all remember the church shooting in South Carolina. Dylan Roof has been, he's competent. He can stand trial. Now, of course, today, judge said thumbs up to him wanting to represent himself. I have to ask you this only because it's a part of really this whole picture today, the big picture, criminal justice system as far as handguns and crime and punishment, and obviously for people that live through situations like today and how they go through appeal process after appeal process, and many of them basically die of old age in a prison facility after causing a whole lot of carnage, and this man did exactly that today. You have a view or views on that, Sam?
I don't think that I don't think my view is any different, or my opinion in that particular crime and punishment is of any more value than anyone else's, because I don't consider myself an expert on that end of it. Lou would be a better person to ask of that. But I'll tell you this. You just brought up an interesting point. All right. First of all, of course Dylan Roof is competent. Of course this guy, if he was alive, would be competent to stand trial. These guys are not crazy in the way that we think of as psychotic, not knowing the difference between right and wrong. They're sociopathic or on that scale, but the idea is that they're not psychotic, they're not crazy people. On top of that, the fact that Dylan Roof decides to represent himself is a perfect, clear, decisive example of the kind of grandiose narcissism that defines the types of people who could actually commit these types of mass homicides. Every single case we've looked at, and a lot of what we do with corporations is threat assessment based. The threat assessment concept is very simple. A vulnerability assessment is what you do to look at an environment. A threat assessment is the human element. Does someone who is making or acting threatening, in fact, pose a threat? And there are very critical indicators that most people don't know to look for. I'll tell you right now that narcissism is a perfect example of one of the critical indicators on the personality side.
We'll come back. Being that he has been here this long, I'd like to finish the hour talking to him. And then after we spend some time with Audrey Geske, we are going to open the phone lines up and get your thoughts on today's incident at Ohio State. Rob Pratte, Monday night, back with Sam Rosenberg from Impacts, livewithconfidence.com in a moment. Just a couple of minutes after CBS Radio News, and they'll have an update on what happened earlier today at Ohio State. The reason why Sam Rosenberg, so nice to join us for the full hour. He, an expert in self-defense, livewithconfidence.com from Impacts, talking about that. So here's the thing. You find yourself in a situation like this, and I think the whole idea of unplugging the technology as far as your earplugs when you're out amongst the living would be a great idea. And my own children, very guilty of that at times, to where I have to remind them, you've got to be all eyes and ears when you're out, especially even just crossing a street. So just some of the things that people can do every day that they can live and, enjoy life one step at a time, but also be on the alert just in case they have to be on the offensive as opposed to being on the defensive.
Well, I think you just said is the critical thing is that to foster the idea of situational awareness is the first thing. So many people nowadays are plugged in and they're tuned out. They're not paying attention to their environment. It's almost epidemic. And, the idea here is that, you want to teach people to become a little bit old school in that regard. When you're out, as you just said, amongst the living, pay attention to your environment. You can't read people's intentions if you're not looking around, if you're not looking at them. You can train yourself in simple ways. For example, where are your exits? I mean, that's such a simple thing to condition yourself to do. It only takes a little bit of active training to do. I'll give you an example. When you go to a restaurant, as you sit down in the restaurant, just identify where the kitchen is and where the front exit is. Notice where you came in and where you have an exit path. There's always an exit through the kitchen. When you go to a movie theater and they tell you, look, notice where the exits are. Actually pay attention. It's the same reason why when you get on an airplane, they do a safety briefing. The first thing you want to do is understand what you're going to do in an emergency. So this doesn't mean that you have to walk around in a state of, paranoia all the time that something bad is going to happen. In fact, on the contrary, by learning how to pay attention to your environment, you can actually relax because you can trust the fact that your intuition and your limbic brain, the part of your brain that has the radar that's always paying attention to everything around you, can do its job and can tell you when there's actually trouble near. And, investing just a little bit of time and energy into figuring out what would I do in the event of is a critical facet in today's world. Everyone has life insurance or health insurance, or a lot of people have life insurance, but most people have health insurance nowadays. We have auto insurance. The reason for insurance is to make sure that in the event of, it's not a total disaster. You have some kind of response plan. Everything you invest in terms of your personal development is valuable. Investing in personal security training is invaluable in my mind because it's the one thing that can keep you alive in the face of true violence. It'll keep you from going into panic or paralysis. I'll tell you, Rob, we talk about it all the time, that in every situation like this, when you have an active shooter, mass killer, whatever, and there are survivors, and the survivors say something along the lines of, I don't know what to do, so I played dead, right? That playing dead response, I guarantee you, was not a conscious coping mechanism. It was not something that someone said, well, I don't know what to do because I don't know how to fight back, and the bad guy's between me and the only exit, so I'm just going to lay here and play possum. That is not the case. What's going on there is a total shutdown of the cerebral cortex, the thinking apparatus, and forced paralysis, where someone is literally shut down into that paralyzed state, into that deer in the headlights. That's the worst case scenario, the ability or the loss of the ability to think under pressure. The goal of training is not to turn people into a ninja. It's to make sure they can think under pressure and make the right decisions.
Because no matter what you think, unless you face it, that problem is not going to go away, and that clock is ticking on your preservation or not. And you have to look at the big picture, especially if you were someone that has responsibilities such as children or a spouse, loved ones of any kind. So it's I guess very important for someone to be of sound mind and body, and that's one of the things that you guys can do and help people in PECs. And I'm sure you've seen stories of the most meek person in the world who you never thought. And maybe with some classes with you and mentoring, they've done things that even surprise you, Sam.
Yeah, no question about it. I mean, we've trained people. We had a 14-year-old girl that we trained not only save herself, but a friend of hers from a sexual assault. I mean, it goes on and on. That's just an example. I mean, a relatively recent one. I mean, what we have here is that the ability to empower people to be able to take full responsibility for themselves, to be able to protect themselves, is a great gift for people. It's something that allows them to not only feel empowered in that facet of what do I do in the event of an emergency, but it gives them confidence in every other aspect of their life. It's true empowerment. It's something that has the ability to impact people in a primal way. And it very often lifts the veil that people live behind, where because now they feel more confident that they can manage a bad situation, they're not constantly trying to delude themselves that bad things can't happen. They instead are living truly in the present, in the world, seeing things for what they are, and they can recognize danger as a result without going into the natural denial mechanisms of hoping and praying that what they think is happening is actually happening.
Listen,
it allows them to respond swiftly.
Got 1 minute left. Hanukkah will be here on Christmas Eve and then run 8 days after. Both you and I, you, of course, because of your faith, we have a lot of respect for Israel and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And Israel has been living with these type of assaults and attacks every day, but they've not only just lived, they've thrived. What do you think we can learn from them, all of us, just in our everyday lives, dealing with this, which has become a part of our headlines every day, as it has in the state of Israel for generations?
We have to recognize that, look, there are no lifeguards. People have to know how to swim. You have to understand that in the moment of truth, there's going to be no one there to save you. In this situation of Ohio State, yes, the professional lifeguard was there quickly, but in the first few moments, there was no one there to help you when you're literally on the X of an attack. The key here is to empower yourself to be able to protect yourself. It's like we always say, rather than giving someone a fish, it's teaching them how to fish. The goal of training is to empower the person to make sure that they can think under pressure, make the right decisions, and more important than anything, recognize danger when it's happening.
All right, Sam. Listen, always a pleasure. I love what you do. Folks, livewithconfidence.com, Impex. Have a great evening and a wonderful holiday.
Thanks, Rob.